They thought she was just a fragile widow quietly fading behind the flowers at her daughter's wedding. What no one realized was that Sylvia Hartley was sitting on a secret worth $33 million, and the man who had just married into her family was about to make the most catastrophic mistake of his life. Marcus Thornfield wasn't just a charming son-in-law, he was a predator. He came armed with dazzling smiles, expensive wine, and legal papers designed to strip an old woman of her freedom, her dignity, and her fortune. But Marcus didn't know that this widow had been underestimated her entire life. And tonight, his greed would light a fire that would burn his entire empire to ash. This is not just a story about survival, it is a story about turning prey into predator. Subscribe now to Silent Lies, because sometimes the sweetest revenge comes with handcuffs. Sylvia Hartley discovered that invisibility can be engineered. It looked like an accident to everyone else, the way the usher parked her at table 12, tucked just far enough behind a fortress of blossoms to keep her face out of any candid photographs. You could have parked a helicopter in that floral arrangement. From where she sat, the world arrived in reflections, the celebration playing out across a gilt mirror while hibiscus and baby's breath fenced her in. She smiled graciously, the way a woman of 72 is expected to smile, and made a private note. The new son-in-law, who thought he had just acquired a pliable mother-in-law, had no idea a storm was studying him from the shadows. She had dressed with the precision of a chess player who has seen the endgame from move one. The gray dress was deliberately quiet, respectful without flair, and the old pearls around her neck were chosen not for glamour, but for gravity. Her hairdresser had smoothed away flyaways and left the rest alone. Harmless, the outfit whispered. Harmless and tidy. The kind of woman who remembers coupons, keeps her thermostat low in winter, and does not ask questions that make powerful people uncomfortable. Her daughter floated through the room in ancestral lace, a family heirloom that had managed to slip through decades of misfortune as if luck itself had been sewn into the hem. Emma glowed in a way that made strangers kind for the length of a ceremony. Sylvia allowed herself the warmth of that sight, then folded it carefully and put it away for later, because the other side of the aisle had arrived in a procession of polished certainty. Marcus's parents took possession of the room the way seasoned donors take possession of a gala. Patricia Thornfield's jewelry flashed like a distress signal to passing aircraft, and her air kisses landed accurately on those who mattered, fluttering past those who did not. When her gaze drifted over Sylvia, it did not stop. It skimmed as if over furniture. The usher apologized as if he were delivering bad news in a hospital corridor. Decorative feature he called the barricade of blooms. What a diplomatic phrase for camouflage. Sylvia thanked him with sugar and took her seat in exile, where the mirror gave her a better vantage point than the head table. She examined the groom the way you examine a painting when the crowd finally moves aside. He had a portfolio of smiles. There was one for old money, one for new money, one for people who could be useful in a month or two, and a fourth, faintly bored one for those whose value had already been tallied and found wanting. The collection impressed her in the way a magician's second-best trick impresses you. It showed skill, but also showed that he wanted you to notice. He came to her at last, wattage up. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, extending the glow to include her. "Is not this magical?" She replied with a sweetness that could rot teeth, and he either missed the acid underneath or chose to behave as if sweetness was all there was. He proposed a dinner, just the two of them, to talk about family collaboration. The phrase was so smooth it squeaked. She agreed with a flutter of the napkin, fanning herself like a southern belle whose corset had been cinched too tightly. Thursday would be perfect, he said. Very private. Excellent for meaningful conversations. How convenient, she thought. Meaningful conversations had a way of arriving with a pen. She caught herself again in the mirror. A woman alone behind a small jungle, dressed to be ignored. She had been building that image for 2 years, ever since Robert's funeral. The posture of modest survival created a distance that generosity could not cross. If you looked like you needed help, you got advice instead of questions. That had been the plan. If anyone was going to study her closely, they would have to fight the flowers to do it. The ceremony unspooled to its end with impeccable taste. Between toasts, she slipped off to the marble lady's room, where the air smelled faintly of orchids and furniture polish. She dabbed lipstick and tried on her harmless expression. The face that looked back was lined and alert. She recognized the line of her mouth, the way it tightened whenever a salesman tried to sell her something she already owned. When she returned, the new husband was giving the elderly Hendersons a curated portion of attention. This was encouraging. Even his kindnesses were budgeted. He made sure to let Sylvia know he was still looking forward to Thursday. "So am I, dear," she said, and she meant it. She enjoyed good theater. The night ended, as these nights do, with the bouquet flying and applause swelling and promises made in clusters near the bar. People drifted toward the doors in pods of laughter, and Sylvia remained behind a moment longer, letting the music shrink and the staff begin their quiet dismantling. She left when she was sure no one would notice her leaving. It was a habit now, the way a spy returns home by a different route than she arrived. After the wedding, the phone filled with her daughter's happy reports about a considerate new husband who spoke often, perhaps too often, about the future and stability and the importance of planning. The word security threaded through the conversations like a warning label no one had read. Sylvia agreed enthusiastically. "A husband should think about money all the time," she said lightly. "Especially money that is not his." Wednesday dragged. She occupied the hours with the rituals of a woman who has known long houses and long marriages, dusting the study where Robert's book still held his shape, deadheading roses that refused to learn humility, putting the kettle on and forgetting it, then putting it on again. She told herself she was curious, not anxious. Curiosity sharpens, anxiety blurs. The restaurant on Thursday evening performed wealth like a play, its waiters moving like dancers trained not to look impressed. Marcus rose before she reached the table, jacket immaculate, watch gleaming with a restrained kind of threat. He complimented her as if they were negotiating a truce. She returned the courtesy and let him select a wine whose name had more syllables than most of her cousins. He began with concern presented as conversation. How was she managing? The house must feel excessive. Decisions pile up. People are not always kind. It was the gentle barrage of a man warming up for the pitch, each sentence a snowflake designed to melt into a drift. She deflected with stories, little ones, about Robert's habit of saving string and about the indignities of new appliances. He laughed in the way men laugh when they wish to seem kind without committing to kindness. It did not take him long to reach the heart of the matter. There were forms that could reduce her worry. Professionals whose entire calling was protecting people like her from predatory strangers. He had, purely by coincidence, a folder that happened to contain precisely the sort of language that could build a fence around her life and then give someone else the key. She opened the folder and read slowly, as if the words required more light than the room gave. Grant of authority, medical decisions, management of assets, efficient pathways in the event of diminished capacity. The sentences were scrubbed clean of malice, but the meaning bled through. "This is thorough," she said, placing her hands on the edges as if steadying it. He explained that expertise had gone into every clause. He said the name of a lawyer she had never met in a voice that suggested famous reliability. He moved forward, politely towards signatures. She asked whether Emma had seen any of this, and he said yes, brightly, as if approval were contagious. She said she would like to run it past her own counsel. The word own cooled the air. He tried to smile through it. He proposed efficiency. He mentioned a notary, casually, which told her where he had hidden the finish line. She asked how he had known she would consider it tonight. He blinked, rearranged his expression, and decided on charm. When she left him, after coffee she did not drink and assurances she did not believe, she walked home with the certainty you feel when a game finally shows its shape. He thought she was on a clock. He thought urgency was on his side. He thought she was alone. Back at her mirror that night, without the shelter of the flowers, she examined the careful costume she had made for herself and saw the thing she had hidden inside it. Not wealth, not even secrets. Patience. Patience was the weapon no one expects from the elderly. They look for fragility and find time. She could wait. She could observe. She could make a room mistake her for a chair while she learned every face, every laugh, every tells of a man who changes his smile the way a dealer changes decks. She slept the way you sleep before an important morning, lightly, measuring the night in doorbell sounds that never came. When dawn arrived, she wrote down a short list with a dull pencil and put it in her handbag. The list had 3 names and 1 question. The names mattered less than the question. How does a person like Marcus choose his targets? By sight, by habit, by weakness, or by presumption, the most dangerous selector of all? When her daughter called to ask how dinner had gone, Sylvia kept her voice even. "Informative," she said. "He means to be helpful." She let the word hang, and then shepherded the conversation toward flowers and vows and the photocopied programs Emma wanted to keep. After the call ended, Sylvia placed the folder Marcus had given her on the kitchen table and watched it as if it were a small, venomous animal she meant to study. She was not angry. Anger could be used against you. She was attentive. There is a kind of attention that removes oxygen from a room. By the time the sun leaned against the window, Sylvia had decided on nothing more dramatic than this. She would put on the same gray dress the next time she saw him. She would be exactly who he thought she was for, as long as necessary. And when the time came for meaningful conversations, the meaning would be hers, not his. He chose a restaurant that practiced intimidation as an aesthetic. The host spoke the word water like a borrowed jewel. The walls offered shadowed reflections instead of comfort, and the waiters looked through guests as if disappointment were part of the menu. Marcus stood as she approached, posture measured, smile calibrated, the kind of greeting that suggests respect and rehearses control at the same time. Sylvia acknowledged him with a warmth that contained exactly 1 degree more heat than politeness requires. She allowed the jacket to be pulled from her shoulders, set her handbag on the chair to her left where a notary could not easily stand, and waited for the performance to begin. He started with gratitude, then concern. He asked about the house, about the brittle weight of decisions, about the little cruelties of living alone that can fray a person's edges without leaving marks. She told him she had learned to fix a leaky faucet and that the roses had taught her patience by refusing to bloom on her schedule. He laughed in the generous way that lets the other person feel amusing without letting them feel powerful. He ordered a bottle whose label contained more history than flavor. She let him. When the wine arrived, so did the folder. He produced it as a magician produces a dove, with a flourish meant to distract from the cage. Tan manila, brass clip. Pages thick with kind sentences that meant unkind things. Protective arrangements, he called them, designed by experts who understand the challenges people in your situation often face. My situation. The phrase perched between them like a bird that bites. She opened the folder and read slowly. The first page offered to relieve her of the burden of decisions. The second proposed that health choices be made by those who love her most. The third simplified financial life by allowing responsible family members to act on her behalf. It was elegant. It was total. It was theft written in the softest ink the law can make. "This is thoughtful," she said. And he glowed. He talked about his attorney, a specialist in elder protection, a man with a reputation for building comfortable fences around complicated lives. Marcus lifted his glass, offered a toast to peace of mind, and set the pen on the table as if he were presenting a gift. She did not touch it. She asked whether Emma had seen the documents. He said yes, bright with filial virtue. She asked one more question, mild as tea. Had he brought a notary, since he seemed so efficient about everything else? He paused, then smiled with the relief of a man who finds the path exactly where he imagined it. He had made arrangements, he admitted, if she wished to proceed tonight. The tablecloth had the texture of money. She pressed 2 fingers into it and felt the threads like a pulse. "I will need to consult my own counsel," she said. The word own cut in quietly. He held the smile, but it lost its shine. "Efficiency matters," he replied. "These arrangements are easier before there is doubt or delay, before there are witnesses," she thought. He framed urgency as kindness and managed to look wounded when she refused the gift of speed. Sylvia closed the folder and placed both hands on it as if it might slide away. "Tell me," she said, "about your work. You seem very sure-footed around legal language for a man in his 30s. He smoothed his cuff with a thumb and described a background in investment management, then adjusted the description to independent advisory, then sanded it down to business experience broadly construed. She asked which firms, and he named institutions without dates. She asked how many families he had protected, and he said a few, then several, then many, as if the numbers multiplied in the glass. She let the quiet gather, the kind of quiet that makes dishonest men reorder their adjectives. His confidence returned in little bursts whenever he could steer the topic back to her safety. That was instructive. Predators prefer compassionate lighting. She pivoted with a small smile that said she had enjoyed the prelude. "My husband had strong opinions about my capacity," she said, and he nodded sympathetically, expecting a confession of fragility. "Robert believed I could decide things for 3 people. Marcus laughed and said that self-knowledge is a strength." She returned the laugh and allowed her eyes to slide to the folder, then to the door where a notary might appear, then back to his face. It was not a threat. It was a weather report. The appetizers came and went. He spoke about efficiency again, about the way delays can raise doubts in outsiders who may question whether someone truly understood what she was signing. She heard what the sentence refused to say out loud. "If you wait too long, we can pretend you are confused." He reached for the pen again. She let it rest between his fingers and tilted her head. "I appreciate your thoroughness," she said, "but I am an old-fashioned woman. I do not make important decisions without sleeping on them and speaking to my advisor." "Your advisor?" he repeated, as if the word might be an invention. "Yes," she said, "the one I have had for years." He recalculated. She watched the numbers move behind his eyes. Charm ratcheted down to civility. The bill arrived with a choreography that suggested prearrangement. He tried one last move, a soft inflection on the word family. "Emma wants you safe," he said, and for a moment, the name of her daughter hung between them like a bridge he meant to control. Sylvia smiled and rose. "I want the same thing," she said, and left the folder closed. Outside, the night had the polished chill that expensive neighborhoods purchase. She walked to the curb and let the air rinse the perfume of the room from her skin. The memory of his surprise at the word notary amused her. She had not been certain he would bring one. Now she was. That was useful. She rode home with the folder in her handbag like a trespasser. Back in her kitchen, she laid it on the table and read everything again, this time as if she were the person it had been designed to capture. She marked 3 clauses on a pad and underlined one sentence that would have mattered most if the trap had closed. The sentence was simple. In the event of diminished capacity, the designated attorney-in-fact shall exercise sole discretion. She copied it twice, then placed the copies in 2 different drawers. Habit. Discipline is a stronger guardian than luck. The next day felt performative in a different way. She visited the library and returned a book she had already read. She walked through the market and bought pears she did not plan to eat. People who are being watched should be seen doing ordinary things. She watered the plants, called her daughter to praise the honeymoon photographs, and let her voice be soft where softness healed. When Emma asked whether the dinner had been pleasant, Sylvia said that Marcus had been charming and that the wine had been complicated. She did not say that he had tried to harvest her signature like a crop. The phone rang the morning after. Marcus had the tone of a man who cannot quite keep eagerness from sounding like victory. He asked if she had considered the documents. She said she had, and that she would be more comfortable discussing them in a setting where she kept her file cabinet. He suggested her home, smooth as silk, and she agreed. She named a time that would render the afternoon long for a man in debt. He accepted at once. After she set down the receiver, she wrote another list. It had 2 names and 1 instruction. Then she called a woman whose voice could crack walnuts and asked for an appointment later the same day. When she arrived at the lawyer's office, the space offered sunlight and family photographs instead of mahogany and gloom. She put the folder on the desk and watched trained eyes travel over sentences designed for someone else's advantage. The lawyer whistled without sound and pointed at the same clause Sylvia had underlined. "This would have isolated you within a week," she said gently. Then she traced another paragraph with a pen and explained how the shape of the signature pages made the trap invisible to anyone who trusted the wrong smile. They spoke for an hour about safeguards that already existed and could be strengthened. The lawyer asked whether Sylvia wished to begin a process. Sylvia answered that she wished to begin too. One of the processes involved the police. The other involved patience. Wednesday approached with a steady tick, each hour a bead on a wire. She chose the same gray dress, the same pearl earrings, the same dignified watch that did not work but still told a story. People should feel that time stands still around you when you are about to change everything. She arranged her living room with the indifference of a hostess who expects nothing remarkable to occur. Then she opened a drawer, pressed a small button, and listened for a red light that did not make a sound. She sat. She waited. When the doorbell finally rang, her heartbeat stepped up 1 rung and then settled where it belonged. Marcus entered like a man who had convinced the universe to agree with him. He set his briefcase on the coffee table and folded his coat over the chair, as if creating a home within her home. He placed the folder in the center, slid the pen from its sheath, and smiled the smile he saved for people he was about to move. "The way you move a pawn to reveal a rook." He said words that sounded like kindness and meant control. She answered with words that sounded like confusion and meant consent to nothing at all. She let her hand shake once, gently, when she reached for the first page, then steadied it with a breath. She signed 1 initial on a sheet that obligated her to nothing. She asked a question that made his eyes brighten. "What happens to my accounts after this?" He said a phrase about professional management and used the word permanent near the word protection. She set down the pen. "There may be more money than you think," she said softly. He stilled. Then the hunger showed itself plain as daylight. "How much more, Sylvia?" "Significant," she said. "Enough to matter to a man in trouble." His fingers tightened on the table's edge before he could stop them. She watched that small tremor with the affection of a scientist who has proven a theory. 3 more questions. 2 more answers. One last glance toward the hallway where no one stood yet. She lifted the pen once more, poised it above the line that would have made her a ward of a stranger wearing her daughter's last name, and smiled with a sweetness that would rot teeth. The clock in the hall struck the hour. Somewhere behind a wall, a red light that did not make a sound kept burning. He mistook the quiet of her living room for surrender. It was the kind of quiet that reassures careless men that everything they want is within reach, the stillness of a lake that hides a current strong enough to pull a body under. Marcus arranged his papers with the ritual of a priest, centering the forms, squaring the corners, aligning the signature flags so that all a trembling hand had to do was follow their cheerful arrows toward oblivion. His notary hovered by the doorway, trying to look invisible, pen already uncapped. Sylvia let her fingers tremble once, as if age had finally remembered her address. It won her a look of manufactured compassion that did not reach his eyes. He asked if she was comfortable. She said that she was. He thanked her for trusting him. She said that she was not doing that. He laughed, small and golden, the laugh of a man who has learned that women will allow him to pretend that words mean nothing as long as the tone feels kind. He began to guide her through the pages, his voice low, the cadence soothing. This section clarifies your wishes if you are ever unable to express them. This one authorizes Emma and me to shield you from predatory influences. This one consolidates your accounts to streamline management. The phrases were pillows, stuffed with brick. She initialed once in a harmless margin and paused. "It is an elegant machine," she said softly. He thanked her for noticing. She tilted her head. "A machine works for whoever holds the switch." He did not blink. People like Marcus do not blink. They wait until you give up and hand them your future. And they call that patience. She asked about reversibility. He spoke about permanence with the reverence of someone offering salvation. She set down the pen and folded her hands on the coffee table. "There may be more money than you think," she said, and watched his composure rip at the seams. "How much more?" "Significant," she said, and let the word hang like perfume. His hands shook before the rest of him did. He reached for calm as a drowning man reaches for a ladder that is not there. The notary cleared his throat. Marcus flashed him a look that said everything was fine, that the performance would conclude in triumph on schedule. Sylvia lifted the pen again, hovered it over the signature line, and then laid it gently across the top of the page, as if putting a child to bed. "I should tell you something," she said. He smiled with all his teeth. "Of course. I am recording this conversation." His smile fractured. "Excuse me. Also, a private investigator has been very interested in your schedule, your debts, and your companions. A capable woman. She documents things." He opened his mouth and then closed it again, like a fish adjusting to new water. "And there is an attorney," Sylvia added, "who specializes in protecting elderly people from predators who dress their theft as devotion." "You are making a serious accusation," he said, but the music had gone out of his voice. "No," she said, "I am making a serious record. Would you like to continue the demonstration for the camera, or would you like to leave these pages untouched by my signature and your fingerprints?" He tried to laugh and produced only breath. "You do not understand, Sylvia. I am trying to help." "Yes, you are trying to help yourself to my life. It is a common misunderstanding among men who believe that older women confuse attention with safety." He looked toward the hallway. Something in him knew there were eyes he could not see. He gathered the papers with abrupt hands and slid them back into the folder. "The way you stow a weapon when you realize the barrel has been pointing at you." "This is not over," he said. "It is," she said, and she believed it. He left without slamming the door, which told her he still thought he could return as a civilized savior if brute force failed. The notary stumbled along behind him, relieved to be escaping a room that had ceased to be predictable. When the house was quiet again, Sylvia sat very still and let the adrenaline leak away. Then she poured water, drank it without tasting it, and went to the drawer in the hallway. She pressed the button that silenced the red light and returned the room to ordinary life. The recording device had done its work. That night she slept like a general who has survived the first skirmish and knows that the real campaign starts at dawn. In the morning she stood at the top of the basement stairs with Robert's key in her hand. She had avoided the room for 2 years, pretending that grief could be managed by closing a door. The air below smelled of paper and old cologne, and the gentle dust that settles on a life paused in mid-sentence. Robert's desk sat where he had always left it, the coffee ring like a halo, the crossword folded at 18 down. The safe did not announce itself. It waited behind a panel that had always looked like concrete and turned out to be intelligence disguised as dullness. She pressed the hidden catch he had shown her once and immediately wished she had asked him to show her twice. The door yielded. Inside, the future waited in envelopes and binders and a letter on thick paper that made her throat close before she unfolded it. My dearest Sylvia, it began in the hand that could steady her from across a crowded room. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and someone believes you are vulnerable. I am sorry for that, and I am sorrier that I hid what I hid, but I preferred you safe to you sorry. The number appeared in the next paragraph like a sunrise that hurts your eyes. $33 million. Properly protected. Completely yours. She sat in his chair because her knees required furniture. 33 million was not a sum you grasped. It was a landscape. Under the letter lay bank statements from accounts she had never heard named aloud, investment records that told the story of decades spent building a shelter in secret, and trust documents that were not shields only, but swords. At the bottom of the stack lay a business card, Carol Peterson. She placed the card on her palm like a coin and dialed the number before doubt could argue. Hartley, the voice said, crisp and warm. I have been waiting for your call. They met that afternoon in an office that chose light over intimidation. Carol had eyes that could separate truth from style and a handshake that made promises and then kept them. Robert prepared for the day someone would try to move you out of the center of your own life, she said without preface. He made it almost impossible. She explained the trust Robert had built, its irrevocable bones, the way it allowed Sylvia to command everything while allowing no one else to seize control, even if some document persuaded a stranger that she could not tie her own shoes without supervision. He tried the classic approach, Carol said, tapping one of Marcus's clauses with a pen. Urgency, isolation, the illusion of inevitability. It is a very old con that prefers new paper. You will be safe even if you had signed. But we are not going to let it get that far with anyone else he touches. Anyone else, Sylvia repeated, tasting the plural. Men like your son-in-law do not work alone. The words were a door. Behind it lay a corridor of other doors. Carol laid out a plan with the attention of a surgeon building a map of arteries. They would record, coordinate with law enforcement, invite Marcus to try again on terms that documented his intentions beyond denial. Then they would widen the lens. The debts, the associates, the attorney who specialized in elder protection but preferred elder plunder, the banker who waived transfers through at closing time, the state lines, the pattern. Networks present themselves as coincidences until you string them together. For the first time since the wedding, Sylvia felt heat in her chest that did not come from anger. It felt like permission. Robert had not only guarded her, he had armed her. She asked how to begin. Carol smiled like someone who enjoys good work. We already did. You walked in. That evening Emma called. Marcus is upset, she said, fragile and defensive in the same breath. He thinks you misunderstood him. I think he hoped I would. There are things you do not know, sweetheart. About your husband, about your father, about me. There was a long silence, the kind that introduces adulthood into a room. I want to know, Emma said. Tomorrow, Sylvia answered. Tonight I will read. She read until the letters blurred. She read Robert's instructions twice and then a third time to hear his voice in the margins. She imagined Marcus rehearsing indignation and strategizing the next breach. She imagined other women in other rooms, signing other lines, each convinced that resistance would be rude. Sylvia turned off the lamp and decided that rudeness could save lives. Morning delivered momentum. Carol called with a prosecutor's name and a calendar. The woman at the district attorney's office listened without surprise and with increasing satisfaction. Classic pattern, she said. We can build a case. We can also set a trap that holds. Sylvia agreed to play her role. Harmless, grateful, confused when needed, entirely dangerous where it mattered. She dressed again in gray. The pearls rested on her collarbone like bright punctuation. She looked into the mirror and saw not a disguise now but a uniform. When she smiled, she could feel both versions of herself at once. The widow people underestimate and the strategist they only meet when it is too late. She picked up the phone and dialed Marcus. I have been thinking, she said, and let a tremor thread the sentence. You may be right. Perhaps I do need the protection you described. His relief traveled through the wire like heat. Of course, Sylvia. I can be at your house this afternoon with everything we need. Perfect, she said, and hung up to the soft click of inevitability. By 3 o'clock, the living room was a stage set. Nothing special, nothing different, only the furniture of a life arranged with polite symmetry. Behind the walls, eyes waited. On the coffee table, the folder waited. In Sylvia's chest, calm waited, a lake with a current that could pull a body under. When the doorbell rang, she breathed once, deeply, and opened the door to a man who believed that signatures would save him. She welcomed him with gratitude that concealed steel. He laid out his instruments. He began his liturgy. She answered in the register of a person who was ready to hand over her life. She signed where signatures cost her nothing. She asked how permanent the protections would be. He said the word permanent again, reverent as a prayer. She asked what would happen to her money. He said it would be professionally managed. She asked by whom. He said by those who care most. Wonderful, she said, and smiled at the exact moment the hallway filled with footsteps. The footsteps arrived like a verdict, steady and undeniable, and the room changed temperature without moving a degree. Marcus did not understand what he was hearing until he saw the uniforms. A notary's pen froze in midair, the cap hovering like a stunned insect before it surrendered to gravity. The officers entered with the quiet economy of people who have practiced removing illusions from rooms. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Please keep your seat. Sir, step back from the table." The syllables were plain, procedural, and devastating. Marcus looked from the signatures he believed he owned to the faces that would decide what he owned instead. His smile attempted resurrection and failed to rise. "It is a misunderstanding," he said. And even the notary flinched at how predictable the sentence sounded out loud. The officer closest to the coffee table read the first page, then the second, his eyes narrowing at the geometry of a con that hid its teeth inside courtesies. He nodded toward the hidden camera that was no longer hidden, and toward the small recorder whose red light had been burning without making a sound. The room had been watching him since he opened his briefcase. Sylvia did not stand. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. Patience is the weapon no one expects from the elderly. When the officers explained what would happen next, she listened without moving her gaze from Marcus's face. "You have the right to remain silent." Silence was, at last, the most expensive thing in the room. He tried to protest, to shape a sentence that would make him the savior again, but the words refused to obey the old choreography. He had used the word protection one time too many. They took his wrists. The sound of metal closing was a small sound, almost polite, and it reached every corner of the house. He said her name once, as if the syllables might still open a door that had closed. She did not answer. The notary cleared his throat and asked to leave, voice papery with shock. An officer escorted him out with a nod that suggested he would be interviewed soon about how often pens had been uncapped in the service of permanent arrangements. When the front door shut behind them, the house exhaled. Carol emerged from the hallway with the prosecutor who had watched from the next room, both women moving the way professionals move when a plan has landed precisely where it was aimed. Carol's eyebrows lifted in a question that needed no words. Sylvia nodded once. The prosecutor smiled a small, fierce smile. "We have what we need." It was not triumph she heard, it was certainty. They packed the equipment with delicate hands. The memory cards went into labeled envelopes, the copies of copies into a folder marked with a date that would matter later. The prosecutor thanked Sylvia for her composure and for her patience and for understanding that sometimes you fight by staying very still. Carol touched Sylvia's shoulder, the brief pressure of one soldier to another. "We are only at the beginning," she said, and meant it as a promise rather than a warning. The news broke before sunset. A local anchor stood in front of the courthouse and translated a story about forms and trust and family into the blunt language of evening broadcasts. Local businessman arrested in elder fraud sting operation. The phrase elder fraud slid across the screen with the undertone of a crime that provokes a special kind of anger. The footage was unmistakable. Marcus, in a suit that did not know how to be humble, stepping from a police car into the thin air of a public humiliation he had once assigned to other people. His face tried to locate the camera and discovered there were too many. Emma called with tears already in her voice. "Mom, what have you done?" The question fell apart midway between accusation and plea. Sylvia sat at the kitchen table where the pen had rested earlier and spoke with more softness than the world deserved. "I have protected myself from a man who meant to remove my life from my hands and arrange it to his convenience. This will destroy him," Emma said, as if destruction had been an unexpected side effect rather than the point of law. "It is not destruction. It is consequence." An hour later, Emma stood in the doorway as if the floor might argue with her feet. Sylvia poured tea and pressed the warm cup into her daughter's hands before pressing play. The living room watched itself, the careful concern, the invitations to permanence, the sly geometry of a signature page that made a person disappear while leaving their body in the chair. It was all there, in the kind voice of a man who had learned to harvest trust the way other men harvest crops. Emma's breath shortened when the word permanent arrived. Her eyes shifted when the word protection appeared beside it like a decoy. By the time the red light became the most important color in the room, tears had become a decision. "He was going to put you away," she said, voice flat. "He was going to call it love." Sylvia nodded. "He was going to call it inevitable." Emma set the cup down with both hands, like a person returning a fragile object to a shelf. "I will speak to a lawyer in the morning," she said. And the sentence contained a funeral the evening did not have time to hold. Morning delivered the bond hearing. The courtroom smelled like dust and consequence, the kind of air that remembers every sentence ever spoken inside it. Marcus tried to recalibrate the narrative, to explain that his efforts were an extension of filial duty, that he had been entrapped by paranoia and grief. The judge was unmoved. The recordings were not opinions. They were architecture. The number assigned to bail made a blunt statement about the court's assessment of his intentions. He would remain where cameras could not follow him except on official days. By noon, the federal agents had called. The pattern was familiar, they said. The names around him were familiar too. A ring prefers rings. Networks that hunt the elderly hunt across county lines, bank districts, polite societies. "Do you wish to participate in a wider investigation?" Sylvia looked at Carol. Carol looked at Sylvia. Yes. The answer was not a roar. It was a click. Meetings followed the way summer follows spring. The district attorney's tone had sharpened to the edge of pleasure. Classic pattern, family proximity, manufactured urgency. Document laundering through cooperative professionals who do not wish to see ink for what it is. We will build outward. We will require patience and precision. We will ask you to play the gracious widow a while longer. Sylvia agreed without needing to look in a mirror to know that the gray dress and the pearls were ready. They had become less camouflage than uniform. Calls arrived from women whose names she did not know yet. One had nearly signed last year. Another had lost access to her accounts for 6 months while a nephew discovered how to rename theft. A third had been told that resistance would prove her confusion and therefore justify taking everything away. Each voice rehearsed the same shame, the shame that keeps widows polite when they should be dangerous. Sylvia listened until listening became a blade. Then she promised what she was now able to promise. "You are not alone." The sentence had the shape of a bridge. The second evening after the arrest, Patricia appeared. She wore dignity like a coat that no longer fit. "You have ruined my son," she said, and the pronoun felt heavier than the noun. Sylvia moved a second cup from the cupboard to the counter and then left it empty. "Your son ruined himself," she answered. "I merely switched on the light." Patricia's breath sharpened. "You could have handled this privately. Families should not disgrace each other in public." Sylvia inclined her head. Families should not attempt to steal each other's lives and call it guardianship. The conversation ended where it had begun, with the impossibility of two realities sharing a table. Patricia left with the same hauteur she had brought into the wedding hall. Sylvia watched her go and felt nothing at all. The third day brought a different kind of call. The prosecutor at the federal office had a spreadsheet in her voice. "We are mapping transactions tied to Marcus and 3 associates. We are looking at signatures, notaries, transfers timed for late Friday afternoons. We will need your statement and your patience." Sylvia supplied both. She slept better that night than she had in months. When the week turned, the program that did not yet have a name began to exist. Carol drafted frameworks. The prosecutor drafted motions. The agents drafted checklists. Sylvia drafted a promise to herself and set it where she could see it each morning. "I will be polite only when politeness serves justice." She thought of other living rooms and other pens. She thought of the way a word like permanent can be made to sound like mercy. Then she thought of the sound metal had made closing around Marcus's wrists. It was not loud, it was perfect. The message arrived early the next day. Emma had filed papers. The sentence was small on the screen and enormous in the air. Sylvia stood at the window and watched the street, where delivery vans and dog walkers performed the calendar of ordinary life. The ordinary had become beautiful again. It had become possible. She boiled water, steeped leaves, and carried the cup to the table where the folder had once waited. She was alone, and not alone. Vulnerable and not vulnerable. Finished with one battle and beginning another that was larger and much older than her house. By evening, the calls had multiplied. Reporters wanted a quote, advocates wanted a face, lawyers wanted a witness. Sylvia said no to the first, yes to the second, and to the third she said the only sentence that mattered. Tell me how to help the next person before the pen touches the line. The prosecutor laughed softly. We will make a list. Night lifted the edges of the day. In the quiet, she reread Robert's letter, the one that had turned absence into provision. He had left her a structure that money could not collapse. He had also left her permission to be dangerous when danger would serve the good. She placed the letter back in its envelope and turned off the kitchen light. Upstairs, the house settled around her like armor. Beyond the hedges, in a cell where the air did not bend to charm, a man rehearsed his version of events and discovered that words cannot reverse architecture. In the morning, there would be more meetings, more lists, and a decision about whether to widen the first door the sting had opened into a corridor the entire country could walk through. Sylvia slept, which is another name for strategy when the work continues. The city learned the name of a crime it had preferred to ignore, and the air changed. Doors opened with new caution. Bank tellers began to examine signatures as if they were weather maps. In the days after the arrest, Sylvia sat at her kitchen table while the phone transformed from a household object into a switchboard for a campaign. Agents called with lists. The district attorney called with schedules. Carol called with questions that were really strategies. Each conversation tightened the net around a man who had believed nets were for other people. The first meeting with the federal team took place in a room that valued light more than ceremony. Files appeared like bricks, and the agents stacked them until the table carried a new kind of weight. A woman with sharp eyes traced arrows across a map and turned coincidences into a system. Transactions that had once seemed random revealed their rhythm. Friday afternoons, just before branches closed, midweek transfers just below thresholds that trigger reviews, notarizations stamped by the same 2 or 3 wandering officials who always seemed to be available on short notice. Men like Marcus did not invent originality. They purchased repetition and hoped no one would notice the pattern until the money had developed amnesia. Sylvia learned to recognize the vocabulary of pursuit, predicate acts, structured withdrawals, durable powers used as crowbars. She learned to recognize a louder language too, the language of victims who spoke in low voices because shame teaches people to whisper, a retired teacher whose pension had been put on a leash. A widower told that refusal proved confusion. A grandmother whose own children had been convinced she was incapable of deciding when to water her plants. Sylvia listened until the outrage became a tool she could hold without burning her hands. Then she did the thing rage alone cannot do. She planned. Emma arrived one evening with eyes that looked older than photographs taken 3 months earlier. She sat at the kitchen table and watched the steam from her cup rise like an answer. He was going to move you, she said, somewhere convenient for him. He was going to call it safety. Sylvia did not touch the hand that lay on the table because she had learned that sometimes comfort interrupts clarity. He was going to call it inevitable, she said. Emma nodded and began to speak about a lawyer who returned calls quickly and a file that would end a marriage without pretending to extract a lesson from the wreckage. I thought love was a shelter, she said. Sometimes it is a story people tell about their intentions, Sylvia answered. The thing you build with actions is the shelter. The Thornfield family came next, as families do when the arc of a story turns and they begin to sense the shape of the ending. Patricia arrived wearing the remains of supremacy like a shawl that remembered better winters. You have disgraced us, she said, and Sylvia offered a chair that Patricia did not take. Sylvia kept her voice level. The way you keep a blade steady when you are cutting a straight line. Your son orchestrated his own disgrace. I provided a mirror. Patricia demanded discretion, insisted on privacy, begged for mercy without using the word. Mercy belongs to the repentant, Sylvia said. Your son believes the crime is failure, not harm. Patricia left with silence for dignity, and the silence failed to do the work. The program did not have a name, and then it did. It did not have a budget, and then it had one that made phones stop ringing only because answers arrived before questions were asked. Carol and the prosecutors designed intake processes that treated humiliation as a wound rather than a mood. Agents built a language for patterns that would teach a jury to understand the clockwork of a theft disguised as caregiving. Sylvia wrote a check that did not make a dent in the trust and made a canyon in the landscape predators thought they owned. Money is a tool, Robert had written, and tools are meant for building and for breaking. Use it for both. Old cases woke like bears in spring. A banker decided to explain why 3 signatures always looked like cousins of each other. A lawyer who had prepared dozens of protective instruments developed sudden interest in cooperation when the calendar began to resemble a prison sentence. A real estate broker who had never asked why a certain class of sellers always moved into facilities within the month discovered a conscience. Each defection snapped another line in the web that had seemed so comfortably spun. News cameras wanted a heroine and a soundbite. Sylvia refused to play someone smaller than herself for their story. She chose quiet rooms with people who would trade the spectacle of outrage for the machinery of consequence. When asked for a statement, she offered the only one that mattered. Protect the next person before the pen touches the line. Her voice did not climb. It landed. Marcus learned how quickly a story can find its true author. He tried to purchase a different narrative with the currency of pity and the counterfeit of regret. The judge declined to accept either. The bail number stayed where it had been planted. In the limbo between arrest and trial, investigators discovered debts that moved like weather across casino ledgers and debts that did not move at all because the men owed preferred to break things other than hearts. They discovered a mentor with a family name that made the network feel less like an accident and more like a business plan passed down at holidays. They discovered a plan to relocate Sylvia to a facility with pleasant art and permanent rules. The admissions director had a folder with spaces already prepared for Sylvia's name. There is a satisfaction that is not joy when a plan proceeds. Sylvia felt it the day the first multi-state indictment unfurled like a banner. She did not celebrate. She made lists. Names of women who needed their accounts unfrozen and their confidence thawed. Names of men who had convinced themselves that kindness required control. Names of professionals who would decide this once whether to stand on the side of order or ease. The lists grew, then shrank, then grew again as victims told other victims that a phone call would be answered with something more than sympathy. Emma's papers finalized with a signature that did not shake. She moved back into a small apartment with windows that accepted light like truth. One evening, she brought over a cardboard box that held pieces of a life she no longer owed anyone, receipts for gifts she had never wanted, photographs of smiles that looked different now that context had adjusted the exposure. On top lay the lace from the wedding, carefully folded, ancestral luck holding fast even when the story changed. "Keep it," Emma said. "It belongs to history." Sylvia replaced luck with choice and put the lace away. The call from the federal office came on a quiet afternoon when the light had that generous quality that makes even paperwork seem almost handsome. "We have enough for a sweep," the agent said. The word sweep sounded like brooms and like wind and like the clean edge of justice. Sylvia asked how many doors would open. "Dozens," the agent answered. When the arrests came, they came without spectacle and with precision, because someone had learned that predators prefer applause and the law prefers evidence. After the first trials began, Aaron from the prosecutor's team visited Sylvia with a stack of victim statements that needed signatures and a question that looked like an opportunity. "Would you consider endowing a permanent fund that allows us to move faster than the criminals do?" The number she named would have intimidated a city council. Sylvia considered the letter in Robert's hand and the instruction he had not written but had implied in every clause. "Make them regret the day they chose you." She wrote the check and watched a machine begin to move with a speed that felt like grace. Nights grew easier. Not light, but easier. Sylvia still read until her eyes refused. But now the words were reports of assets returned, guardianships dissolved, injunctions granted that held the line while a daughter convinced a mother she was not losing her mind. She walked through her garden and found that the roses, which rarely bowed to any schedule but their own, had decided to bloom with improbable discipline. She cut one and placed it in a glass beside the sink where she could see it while she worked. It is a small thing to place beauty next to duty, but small things are the furniture of endurance. A man showed up at her door with a smile that used to work. He introduced himself as a partner of Marcus and as a friend of reason. He said they could make this go away with cooperation and with a tasteful expression of contrition. Sylvia listened the way you listen for a leak in the wall, not for the sound itself but for the place it repeats. Then she called Carol. By the end of the week, the man's smile had been entered into evidence. On a morning that began ordinary and stayed that way long enough to feel suspicious, the agent with the sharp eyes called with a new map. "We have traced the origin of the method to a man who trained your son-in-law." The name carried a chill that had nothing to do with weather. "The family business," the agent said gently. "We will dismantle that too." Sylvia set down the phone and let the silence take its full shape. Some wars begin in living rooms and end where families have passed recipes and techniques with equal pride. She had expected many things. She had not expected to feel this calm. She returned to the table where everything had begun and wrote another list. At the top, she wrote a sentence that would guide the next season. Build a wall for the vulnerable and a trap for the hunters. Then she placed the list under a paperweight that had once sat on Robert's desk and went to make tea. The kettle sang. The house listened. Somewhere, men who had underestimated widows began to understand that their calendars had changed in ways they could not charm back to normal. The season that followed did not feel like triumph. It felt like work that refused applause. Files became maps, and maps became decisions, and the decisions kept opening doors that had been painted to look like walls. Federal agents called with updates that sounded like the incremental progress of a long winter thaw. A name here, a bank there, a notary who finally admitted that convenience had become a habit he could not defend under oath. What used to be isolated stories gathered into a single narrative with chapters written in courtrooms instead of living rooms. When the first convictions arrived, the relief was quiet, almost private. Paperwork did not celebrate, it simply recorded. Sylvia learned that victory is a discipline. Each afternoon she reviewed summaries from the team that now stretched across jurisdictions. Each line carrying the weight of someone's fear converted into evidence. She signed endowment documents that ensured investigators could move at the speed that predators hated. She met with prosecutors who understood that shame is the lock that keeps doors closed long after the thief has left the house, and that the system must pick that lock gently and quickly. She sat with victims who had been told that they were confused, and she watched clarity arrive like sunrise through dirty windows. She made tea. She listened. She made lists. The news media tried to make her a symbol. Symbols are tidy. Her work was not. She accepted only the attention that purchased leverage for the next operation. When a glossy profile requested photographs by the safe in her basement, she declined and sent them a single sentence instead. Protect the next person before the pen touches the line. The editor wanted something warmer. She sent the same sentence again. Warmth would be measured in assets returned and homes unemptied, not in adjectives. Marcus moved through the judicial calendar like a man who had misplaced the script he used to live by. His lawyer tried strategies that sounded like apologies wearing costumes. The recordings did not care what costume a sentence wore. The jury listened to the cadence of his persuasion and heard the machinery inside. The verdict arrived with the soft finality of a door that has found its frame. Years were pronounced. People whispered. Marcus stared at the table a little too long, the way a man stares at a prop that used to make him the star. When the judge spoke about predation disguised as protection, even the court reporter looked up. What followed should have been the end of his presence in Sylvia's life. It was not. There were motions and hearings and the slow math of appeals that rarely change outcomes, but always require breathing. Sylvia learned to regard his name the way she regarded a distant siren. It did not enter her house unless she chose to open the window. Instead, she watched the map. The network that once fed on widows learned to fear a new phrase. The prosecutors called it the Sylvia Hartley situation, and the phrase traveled through quiet conversations like a superstition. It meant that a polite woman might be the most dangerous person in the room because she had practiced patience longer than you had practiced charm. Meanwhile, the work grew larger than the case that started it. Federal partners proposed a program with a spine and with teeth, a permanent machine that would not hunt one ring but many, that would educate banks and train police and give prosecutors the tools they needed before a file turned into a funeral. The budget would be large. The mandate would be larger. Sylvia read the legislation in draft the way she had once read trust documents, word by steady word, looking for the hidden doors and building them herself when she could not find them. She financed the beginning and insisted on a design that would make the program fund itself through forfeitures so that it could outlast her, outlast trends, outlast the attention span of the news. There were weeks that felt like weather. Storm, then clear, then sudden gusts that rattled the calendar. An associate pleaded guilty and began to talk in paragraphs that named banks and houses, and the exact time of day signatures grew careless. An attorney who had profited from permanent arrangements discovered that the permanence extended to consequences. A banker explained that red flags had looked pink under the soft lighting of a favored client. Pink is not a color, Sylvia told him kindly. It is a warning. He nodded and agreed to testify. Emma rebuilt a life without pretending to salvage the pieces that were never true. She did not search for meaning in wreckage. She chose meaning in the work. She joined a support group that taught people to replace embarrassment with vocabulary. She learned the phrases predators use and the silences they prefer. She came to meetings with Sylvia's team and spoke to families that were exactly where she had been, her voice steady, her compassion precise. One night, after a long day that ended with good news for a woman who had almost lost her home, Emma asked the question that daughters ask when life has pivoted so far that the horizon looks new. Are you happy? Sylvia considered the garden, the letter, the red light that had once burned without making a sound. Happiness is not the right measure, she said. I am accurate. I am useful. I am at peace with the cost. When the agents traced the method back to its teacher, the map changed scale. The mentor's name sat inside the Thornfield family tree like a dark fruit. The discovery did not bring shock. It brought completion. The federal team moved with deliberate speed, the way surgeons do when they know the organ they are removing has fed smaller malignancies in places you cannot see. The indictment read like history catching up. Doors opened. Hands were taken gently and then cuffed. In depositions, the mentor tried to perform aggrieved dignity and ended up performing inventory. Names, amounts, locations. The network began to fold on itself like a paper animal under rain. Invitations arrived from Washington. Hearings were scheduled. Senators wanted a story they could remember and a policy they could defend. Sylvia wore a navy suit and Robert's anniversary earrings and spoke into a microphone, as if speaking into a living room where a pen waited on a table. She did not flatter the room. She described the machine. She said the words life imprisonment and did not look away while she said them, because stealing an old person's independence is a life sentence carried out in daylight. She asked for a statute that would name the harm correctly and punish it in proportion to its damage. Cameras clicked. The bill moved. 2 days later, Sylvia sat in a different chair under a different flag. The parole board's walls were the color of old binders. Marcus entered thinner, eyes measuring the room for angles that no longer existed. His lawyer said the expected words: rehabilitation, remorse, model behavior. Sylvia read her statement without ice and without mercy. She described the architecture of his attempt, the scope of his debts, the ease with which he had used the word permanent while planning to erase a life. Then she asked the only question that mattered: what has he learned? Marcus could not help himself. Some men cannot stop proving the case against themselves. He spoke about unfairness and about luck and about how certain people do not deserve what they have. The room recorded the moment it needed. The board denied parole. The door closed again. The program launched at scale the following season. Training sessions turned officers into readers of patterns rather than collectors of anecdotes. Banks installed early warning systems that treated loneliness as a risk factor. Medical professionals learned to see the legal bruise that forms when a patient's signature is pressed too often. A number appeared in quarterly reports that had not existed before. Assets recovered without litigation because someone made a call before the ink dried. The number grew. On a morning that began with simple light and the sound of a kettle making promises it could keep, Sylvia received an envelope with the seal of an office that had once felt very far away. The letter inside suggested a ceremony in a room famous for its applause. She accepted, not because metals change what has already been done, but because platforms can be converted into ladders for the next person to climb. On the day itself, the air held that bright formality that history prefers. When she spoke, she kept it short. Trouble does not leave you alone because you are polite to it. If you prey on the elderly, understand that we are organized, we are funded, and we are looking for you. Afterward, she returned to her house that smelled like paper and lemons and work. She placed the medal in a drawer beside Robert's letter, because one had made the other possible, and because neither meant anything without the discipline that would follow tomorrow. The phone rang. It was a new case. A woman in another state with a son who had discovered the power of permanent. Sylvia took down the details. She wrote a name. She made a list. The roses outside the window did not know it was history. They knew only light and time and the stubbornness it takes to bloom after being cut back. She set the receiver down and stood for a moment in the quiet that follows action. The war was not over. It was only better organized. Somewhere, a man like Marcus looked at a pen and hesitated for the first time in his career. That hesitation was the measurement of their success. She smiled once, the private smile of a woman who no longer mistook patience for weakness, and went back to work. In the end, this story was never just about a wedding, a set of legal papers, or even $33 million locked in a hidden safe. It was about a widow who chose not to be prey. Sylvia Hartley could have lived quietly, disguising her wealth behind modest dresses and polite smiles. Instead, she transformed her grief into a weapon, her caution into a strategy, and her late husband's legacy into a war chest for justice. Marcus Thornfield thought he was marrying into money. What he didn't know was that he had walked straight into the lair of a dragon, one that breathed fire not from anger alone, but from preparation, patience, and precision. Her victory was not measured in revenge, but in protection. Entire networks fell. Dozens of predators were unmasked. Millions were restored to those who had been silenced by shame. And Sylvia's message echoed far beyond her quiet living room. No one is too old, too fragile, or too powerless to fight back. When armed with truth and the courage to use it, even the underestimated can become unstoppable. This is what Silent Lies is about: ordinary voices refusing to remain silent, hidden truths brought into the light, and predators who finally pay the price for their arrogance. If you believe stories like Sylvia's deserve to be told, if you want to witness the moments where the weak become strong and the hunted become the hunters, then stay with us. Subscribe now to Silent Lies, because some secrets are meant to be exposed, and some lies should never stay silent.